I need to start downsizing my arcade cabinets. Hello all, welcome back to the corner. I wish this was my cab, but unfortunately it's not. One of the things I've always wanted in my home was a dancing stage cabinet, or DDR as other people may know it. The thing is, as you can tell, these are huge. They are noisy, but man are they fun to play. As I've said in the live stream, because of the size of these cabinets, they're not exactly house friendly, shall we say. So I thought to myself, what if I could just create a scale cabinet? Seems like a good idea, doesn't it? So this brings me to why I'm here today. First of all, this is the first time I've ever seen a dancing stage supernova cab in person, and it's also the only cab I've seen in the last 5 years.
The second reason is I'm going to need accurate measurements if I'm going to make a scale model, so I needed a real cab to measure from.
Now, since I'm a DDR fan and I'm a bit eccentric in that sense, my project has a couple of goals. First of all, it has to be fully playable. That means that the screen, the computer, all the I/O stuff has to be in the inside of the cabinet. Second of all, every single light that was on the original cabinet must work. And finally, I want to try to get the sound to be as good as possible in a smallish dimension. Now, this might not be possible at the scale I'm going for, but we'll have to see how I get on with that. I've been talking scales a lot, so what is the scale I'm actually going to be making this cab at? Well, I've had a long think. I'm going to make it a quarter scale of the original cabinet. That means every dimension will be 1/4 to the real cabinet, and I'm going to be trying to make the cabinet as accurate as I can. Now, my only concern with the whole quarter scale of the cabinet is going to be this dance pad. Now, the reason is, when I scale this down to 1/4 the original size, you'll no longer be able to play it with your feet, which is to be expected, but it might still be too big to play with your hands. So whether or not I end up having to make an actual smaller pad to be able to use it as a hand pad, that I will have to see when it comes to it. So with that, I think it's time for some measuring. Ah, the most accurate of measuring things, a pointy stick. A cool stick. Ah. With all of that measuring, now we have this lovely model. Now, this only took me about a few months to design, and then it only took me about a year to show it to you all. Well, okay, it took me about a year to make this video about it. And it wasn't because I was procrastinating making the cabinet, but I needed to get some tools to actually be able to make it. And then I needed to use those tools to make some more tools. Links are in the descriptions to the second channel where I go into details about that. Now, as you can see from the front side, it looks like the genuine full-size cabinet. That is until you take a good look at its backside. Gentlemen, do try to behave. Comparing this to the full-size cabinet, which is mostly plain aside from some air vents and a tiny I/O panel, this model has an assortment of ports, including an SD card slot for easy updating, audio in and out jacks, 3 USBs for external controllers like soft or hard pads, an oversized fan that might not be necessary, HDMI output, and then somewhere will be a 2.5mm jack for the power input. I will go into the electronics in a future part of this series, as this episode is just to lay out the plans of the build. But anyway, from the front, arguably the most important part, everything is to scale, and that's the problem. And that's how it's already been built. Well, okay, this is actually the first of 2 prototypes that I made to actually check that the idea is sound. Now, whilst it looks decent enough from the front, there's a few problems with this cab. Firstly, whilst the woodworking looks passable, that's only because you're looking at the vinyl covering I put on to hide my shoddy job. Also, another thing that is wrong with these cabs is that these are a bit too short. It's not that I didn't measure twice, it's that I put the wrong measurement on the drawings. But hey, at least it looks like 1/4 of the real cab. What the hell are you doing? Reverse engineering. Also, you might be looking at these edging strips and thinking they look a little thick. In the original cab, these are about 0.7mm steel angles measuring about 20 by 20mm. These edges are aluminium and measure 1 by 10 by 10mm. Now to me, they don't look out of place, but this is already a first example of where I can't exactly scale everything perfectly down. Now I can make 5 by 5mm angle strips, but then they wouldn't even cover the sidewalls. Oh yes, that's right, this entire cab is going to be made out of 6mm MDF. MDF is easy enough for me to work with, and although I have briefly considered plywood, the 5mm plywood I was going to use flexed a lot more than a 6mm MDF did. I also want this cab to be nice and strong, so I'm going to keep it about 6mm unless I can really get away with 3mm for the outside walls. The header marquee section will likely be entirely plastic and likely 3D printed, and if I feel like it, I've got plans for a Betson style header too. Now the stage will be wood based, but it will be metal topped. Some people might hear the wooden stage and think of Betson's cheapness during DDRX, but trust me, for something that you're going to be playing with your hands, it'll be perfectly fine.
Another change that I had to make was instead of having the full range speakers inside of the header, I had to move the full range speakers down into the base of the cabinet down in these positions here.
The issue is that although I have put speakers in the header section, there was just not enough room to fit in full range speakers, so I was only able to design in some tweeters instead. Although, when I was testing this out, this actually works better as the main sound benefits from the enclosure of the cabinet, while the tweeters help to shift away the audio from the base of the cabinet and bring it up towards the level of the monitor. So whilst dimensionally it will be 1/4 scale, those are the alterations I had to make to actually make it functional. I'm sure though we can all agree that no one will really care as long as it sounds great and looks good. Also, for the final design, I will not be using a vinyl wrap. Whilst it's easy to apply and leaves a nice finish, I found I had to sand down and fill in any gaps to make that nice finish. Now, I'd be doing that anyway, but the next problem's a real killer for me. When I applied the vinyl first time, the ends of the vinyl didn't actually stick that well to the bare MDF. Now, I thought this might be a dust problem and I can easily solve it by perhaps putting some primer on, but if I'm going to spray it with primer, I might as well just paint it as well. That, and I can't quite find the vinyl wrap in quite the right shade of grey. Oh, and did I mention I'm trying to make this look like a Euromix 2 cab yet? So about that. When I had spoken to the owners of the machine, they had told me that this was a Supernova model from factory, or at least they bought it being told that. However, after speaking to other people, it's possible that this was actually originally a Dancing Stage Euromix or Euromix 2 cabinet that's been upgraded later on in its life. By coincidence, it had been my original goal to make a Euromix 2 style mini cabinet. This because, despite being objectively a watered down version of DDR to play, it was Euromix 2 that I used to play all the time during the late 2000s.
Wait, why do you want to make a cab based on a worse version of the game?
Well, don't get me wrong, Euromix and Euromix 2 are still great fun to play, but as is a trend with Burnin games and Europe, if a game is a version that's released at all, it's usually pretty watered down in comparison to the Japanese or sometimes American versions. And Euromix and Euromix 2 weren't an exception, missing out on features like PlayStation memory card save swapping, user step edits, the song count being vastly reduced, the list goes on. So it's not a version I'd recommend you start with, or at least just don't play the better versions of the game like DDR Max 2, which is what Euromix 2 is based on. So I guess the only thing left to do now is to get started on building the thing in the next episode. I'd also like to give a shout out to Time Warp Arcade down in Bridgewater, Somerset, allowing me to measure up this cabinet that they've got, and for also partially dismantling it as well.